There are moments in life when reality fractures, when the impossible becomes undeniable, when a single phone call can rewrite everything you thought you knew about the world. This is the story of a boy who vanished into thin air on a summer afternoon in 1979, and the man who discovered 25 years later that his entire life had been built on a lie. It's a story about identity, about the fragility of memory, about how easily a child can disappear, and how impossibly difficult it can be to find them again. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The question that haunts every moment of this investigation is simple and terrifying. How does a child vanish for 25 years without anyone knowing the truth? How does a family survive the not knowing? And what happens when the boy who disappeared becomes a man who has no memory of who he really is? The answer will take us through decades of anguish, through the collapse of an investigation, through the slow erosion of hope, and finally, through a revelation so stunning that even the detectives who uncovered it struggled to believe what they'd found. This is not a story about a happy ending. This is a story about survival, about the cost of time, about what it means to lose yourself and then, impossibly, to be found. Greenfield, Ohio, in the summer of 1979 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where front doors stayed unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. It was a town of just over 5,000 people, nestled in the rolling hills of southern Ohio, where the biggest excitement was Friday night football and the county fair that came through every August. The streets were lined with maple trees that provided shade during the humid summers, and the downtown consisted of a single main street with a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, and a five and dime where kids could buy candy for a nickel. Kevin Sullivan was 7 years old that summer, a skinny kid with a mop of brown hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes no matter how many times his mother pushed it back. He had a gap between his front teeth that made him look younger than he was, and a constellation of freckles across his nose that darkened in the sun. He was shy around adults, but became a different person around other kids, loud and imaginative, the kind of boy who could turn a cardboard box into a spaceship and spend an entire afternoon exploring distant galaxies in the backyard. His mother, Linda Sullivan, was 32 years old, a waitress at the Copper Kettle Diner on Main Street where she'd worked since graduating high school. She had the kind of tired prettiness that came from too many double shifts and not enough sleep. Her blonde hair usually pulled back in a ponytail, her hands always moving, always working. She had Kevin when she was 25, had married his father Tom 6 months before Kevin was born, and had spent the 7 years since trying to make ends meet on a waitress's salary and Tom's irregular income from construction work. Tom Sullivan was a man of few words, the kind of father who showed love through actions rather than affection. He taught Kevin how to bait a hook, how to throw a baseball, how to check the oil in a car. He worked hard when the work was there, drank a little too much when it wasn't, and loved his son in the quiet, complicated way of men who didn't have the words to say it out loud. He was 34 that summer, already looking older, his hands rough from labor, his back starting to ache in the mornings. They lived in a small ranch house on Maple Street, a modest place with white siding that needed painting and a yard that Tom kept promising to fence in. Kevin's bedroom was in the back, filled with secondhand toys and library books, his walls covered with drawings he'd made of dinosaurs and race cars and astronauts. It wasn't much, but it was home. It was safe. It was the center of Kevin's universe, the place where he felt completely, utterly secure. July 19th, 1979, started like any other summer day. Kevin woke up around 8, the sunlight streaming through his bedroom window, the sound of his mother already up and moving in the kitchen. He could smell coffee brewing, hear the low murmur of the television in the living room where his father was watching the morning news before heading out to a job site. Kevin got dressed in shorts and a striped t-shirt, pulled on his sneakers, and wandered into the kitchen where his mother was scrambling eggs. "Morning, baby," Linda said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. "You sleep okay?" "Yeah," Kevin said, climbing onto one of the chairs at the small kitchen table. "Can I go to Danny's house after breakfast?" Danny Morrison was Kevin's best friend, a boy from down the street who was a year older and infinitely cooler in Kevin's estimation. They'd spent most of the summer together, building forts in the woods behind Danny's house, riding bikes around the neighborhood, collecting baseball cards, and trading them on Danny's front porch. Maybe later, Linda said, sliding eggs onto a plate. I need you to stay close this morning. I've got to run some errands, and I want you where I can see you. Kevin made a face, but didn't argue. His mother had rules, and he knew better than to push them too far. He ate his breakfast quickly, drank his orange juice, and then went outside to play in the front yard while his mother got ready for her errands. Tom had already left for work, his truck rumbling away before Kevin had even woken up. The morning was already hot, the kind of humid heat that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Kevin played with his toy cars in the dirt beside the driveway, creating elaborate roads and crashes, narrating the entire adventure to himself in the way that children do when they're alone. His mother came out around 10, her purse over her shoulder, keys in hand. Kevin, I'm running to the grocery store, she called from the front steps. I'll be back in an hour. Stay in the yard, okay? Don't leave the yard. Okay, Kevin said, barely looking up from his cars. I mean it, Kevin. Right here. I'll be back soon. I know, Mom. Linda hesitated for a moment, looking at her son playing in the dirt, and then she got in the car and drove away. It was a decision she would replay in her mind 10,000 times in the years that followed, a choice that seemed so ordinary in the moment and so catastrophic in retrospect. But in that moment, it was just a trip to the grocery store. It was just an hour. It was just a normal Thursday morning in a safe, small town where nothing bad ever happened. Kevin played in the yard for maybe 15 minutes after his mother left. The sun was getting hotter, and he was getting bored with his cars. He looked up and down the street, saw Mrs. Henderson watering her flowers 2 houses down, saw a dog sleeping in the shade across the street, saw nothing particularly interesting. He thought about Danny, wondered if Danny was home, thought maybe he could walk down to Danny's house real quick, just to see if he wanted to play. His mother had said to stay in the yard, but Danny's house was only 4 houses away. He could see it from here. It wasn't really leaving, not really. Kevin stood up, brushed the dirt off his knees, and started walking down the sidewalk. It was a decision made without thought, the kind of casual childhood disobedience that happens 100 times a day in neighborhoods across America. He wasn't running away. He wasn't being reckless. He was just walking to his friend's house on a summer morning, 4 houses down a quiet street in a safe town where everyone knew everyone and nothing bad ever happened. Mrs. Henderson saw him walk by. She'd remember that later, remember waving at him, remember him waving back with that shy little smile of his. She'd remember that he was alone, that he was walking with purpose, that he didn't look scared or upset or like anything was wrong. She'd remember that it was around 10:15, maybe 10:20. She'd remember everything about that moment because it would be the last time anyone who knew Kevin Sullivan would see him as a child. Kevin reached Danny's house and knocked on the front door. Danny's mother answered, a harried-looking woman with 3 kids and a baby on her hip. Hi, Mrs. Morrison. Is Danny home? No. Honey, he went with his dad to the hardware store. They'll be back this afternoon. Oh, okay. Kevin turned and started walking back home, disappointed but not upset. It was still early. There would be time to play later. He walked back down the sidewalk, past Mrs. Henderson who was now dragging her hose to the other side of her yard, past the sleeping dog, past the familiar houses with their familiar yards. He was almost home, maybe 50 feet from his own driveway, when a car pulled up beside him. It was a brown sedan, nothing remarkable, nothing that stood out in his memory later when he would try desperately to remember. The driver was a man, maybe middle-aged, maybe younger, Kevin couldn't tell. The man rolled down his window and smiled. Hey there, buddy. You know where Sycamore Street is? I'm looking for number 42. Kevin stopped walking. His mother had taught him not to talk to strangers, but this didn't feel dangerous. The man was smiling. He seemed nice. And Kevin knew where Sycamore Street was. It was 2 blocks over easy. It's that way, Kevin said, pointing. You go down to the stop sign and turn left. Left at the stop sign, the man repeated, nodding. You know, I'm terrible with directions. Would you mind showing me? Just ride with me to the stop sign and point me the right way. I'll bring you right back. And here is where everything changed. Here is where a normal summer morning became a nightmare that would last 25 years. Here is where Kevin Sullivan, age 7, made a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, because he was 7 years old and the man seemed nice, and it was just to the stop sign and back. I'm not supposed to get in cars with strangers, Kevin said, the warning echoing in his head, but his voice uncertain. That's smart, the man said, still smiling. Your mom taught you right. But I'm not going to hurt you, buddy. I'm just lost. Just to the stop sign. 2 minutes. Kevin hesitated, looking back toward his house. His mother wouldn't be home for another 45 minutes. The stop sign was right there, just down the street. He could see it from where he was standing. 2 minutes. The man seemed nice. He had a kind face. Kevin took a step toward the car. Just to the stop sign? Kevin asked. Just to the stop sign, buddy. Scout's honor. Kevin opened the door and got in. The interior smelled like cigarettes and something else, something vaguely medicinal that Kevin couldn't identify. The man put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, driving slowly down the street. They passed Kevin's house and Kevin looked at it, saw his toy cars still scattered in the dirt by the driveway, saw the empty street, saw everything exactly as he'd left it. They approached the stop sign and Kevin started to say that Sycamore was just left, but the man didn't slow down. He drove right through the stop sign and kept going. Hey, you missed it, Kevin said, his voice small. I know, buddy. Change of plans. And that was it. That was the moment. Kevin's stomach dropped and he reached for the door handle, but the man's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, squeezing hard enough to hurt. Kevin tried to pull away, but the man was too strong, his grip like iron, his other hand still on the steering wheel as he drove faster now, turning left and then right, leaving the familiar streets of Kevin's neighborhood behind. Please, Kevin said, and he was crying now, tears streaming down his face. Please, I want to go home. Please let me go home. Can't do that, Kevin. You're coming with me now. The fact that the man knew his name made everything worse, made it real in a way that hadn't been real before. Kevin screamed, a high-pitched wail of terror, but the man just kept driving, kept his hand clamped around Kevin's wrist, kept his eyes on the road. They left Greenfield behind, drove out into the country where the houses grew farther apart and the roads became narrow and winding. Kevin screamed until his voice gave out, until his throat was raw, until he couldn't scream anymore. And then he just cried, silently, as the car carried him further and further away from everything he'd ever known. Linda Sullivan got home from the grocery store at 11:15. She pulled into the driveway with 3 bags of groceries in the back seat, already thinking about what she needed to do next, already mentally organizing her afternoon. She got out of the car, grabbed 2 of the bags, and walked toward the front door. She expected to see Kevin in the yard, expected to hear him playing, expected everything to be exactly as she'd left it. But the yard was empty. The toy cars were there, scattered in the dirt, but Kevin was gone. Kevin, she called out, not worried yet, just curious. Kevin, baby, where are you? No answer. She set the grocery bags down on the front steps and walked around the side of the house, checking the backyard. Empty. She walked back to the front, looked up and down the street, saw Mrs. Henderson still working in her yard. Mrs. Henderson, have you seen Kevin? Mrs. Henderson looked up, squinting in the sun. He walked by here about an hour ago, honey. Looked like he was heading to the Morrison place. Linda felt the first flutter of anxiety in her chest, still manageable, still rational. He'd gone to Danny's house, even though she'd told him to stay in the yard. He'd disobeyed her. She was going to have a serious talk with him about following rules. She walked down the sidewalk to the Morrison house, knocked on the door, waited. Mrs. Morrison answered, the baby still on her hip, looking harried as always. Hi, Mary. Is Kevin here? Kevin? No, honey. He came by earlier looking for Danny, but they weren't here. That was maybe an hour ago. The flutter became a flutter of real fear now, cold and sharp in Linda's stomach. He came by an hour ago? And then what? Then he left. I assumed he went back home. Linda was already moving, already walking fast back toward her house, her mind racing through possibilities. Maybe he went to another friend's house. Maybe he went to the park. Maybe he was hiding somewhere playing a game. Kids did that. Kids hid in closets and under beds and scared their parents half to death. It was fine. He was fine. She was overreacting. But when she got home and searched the house, called his name in every room, checked every closet and under every bed, checked the garage and the shed in the backyard, the fear crystallized into something harder, something that made her hands shake and her breath come short. She ran back outside, started walking up and down the street, calling Kevin's name, her voice getting louder and more desperate with each repetition. Kevin, Kevin, this isn't funny. Kevin, answer me. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the sound of Linda's voice, by the panic that was now unmistakable. Mrs. Henderson came over, her face concerned. Mr. Patterson from across the street joined them. Within 15 minutes, half the block was searching, calling Kevin's name, checking their own yards and garages, asking if anyone had seen him. "I saw him walk by around 10:20, Mrs. Henderson said again. "He waved at me. He was alone." "Did you see where he went after he left the Morrison house?" Linda asked, her voice breaking. "No, honey. I was working in my garden. I didn't see." By noon, Linda had called the police. By 12:30, 2 officers were at her house taking a statement, asking questions, trying to establish a timeline. Tom had been called at the job site and came racing home, his truck screeching into the driveway, his face white with fear. They sat in the living room, Linda crying, Tom pacing, the officers calm and professional and asking the same questions over and over. "When did you last see him?" 10 o'clock. "Right before I left for the grocery store." "And you were gone how long?" "An hour. Maybe an hour and 15 minutes. "Did Kevin have any reason to run away? Any problems at home? Any fights?" "No," Linda said fiercely. "No, he's a good boy. He wouldn't run away. Something happened to him. Someone took him." The officers exchanged a glance, the kind of look that parents in these situations learn to dread, the look that says they think this is probably a runaway, probably a kid who wandered off and got lost, probably nothing serious. But they went through the motions anyway. They searched the house, searched the neighborhood, put out a bolo to all patrol units. By 2 in the afternoon, search teams were forming. By 3, the entire town knew that Kevin Sullivan was missing. The search that afternoon was massive and immediate. Neighbors, friends, strangers, police officers, volunteer firefighters, everyone who could walk converged on the Sullivan neighborhood and fanned out in all directions. They searched yards and parks and the woods at the edge of town. They searched drainage ditches and abandoned buildings and the creek that ran through the center of Greenfield. They called Kevin's name until their voices were hoarse, listened for any sound that might be a child's cry, looked for any sign that a 7-year-old boy had passed through. Dogs were brought in, bloodhounds that sniffed Kevin's clothing and then led their handlers down the sidewalk, past Mrs. Henderson's house, past the Morrison place, and then stopped at a spot on the street about 50 feet from the Sullivan house. The dogs circled, whined, lost the scent. The handlers looked at each other with grim expressions. "Scent-ins here," one of them said to the lead detective, a man named Frank Morrison who'd been with the Greenfield Police Department for 20 years. "Could mean he got in a vehicle." Morrison's face tightened. A vehicle meant this wasn't a simple runaway case. A vehicle meant someone had taken Kevin, had driven him away from his home, had possibly already left the county or even the state. A vehicle meant they were already hours behind. By evening, the local news had picked up the story. Kevin's school photo was broadcast across southern Ohio, a smiling little boy with brown hair and a gap-toothed grin, missing since 10 o'clock that morning. A tip line was established. The FBI was contacted. Roadblocks were set up on the major highways. The town of Greenfield transformed overnight from a sleepy community where nothing happened into the center of a desperate search for a missing child. Linda and Tom sat in their living room surrounded by police officers and FBI agents and volunteers from the church, and they didn't know what to do with their hands, or where to look, or how to process what was happening. 12 hours ago, Linda had been making eggs for breakfast, watching Kevin play with his toy cars, planning her day. Now she was sitting in a room full of strangers who were asking her if Kevin might have wandered off, if there were problems in the marriage, if Tom had ever been violent, if there was any reason anyone would want to take their son. "We need to consider all possibilities," the FBI agent said, his voice gentle but firm. "In cases like these, statistically, the child is most often taken by someone they know. A family member, a friend, a neighbor. Nobody we know would hurt Kevin," Linda said, her voice hollow. Nobody. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Because who really knew what people were capable of? Who really knew what darkness lived behind the friendly faces on their street, behind the smiles at church on Sunday, behind the wave hello from a neighbor working in their yard? Kevin had trusted someone enough to get into their car. Kevin had gone willingly, or at least without enough resistance to attract attention. That meant Kevin had known them, or felt safe with them, or been fooled by them. The first 48 hours of a missing child case are critical, everyone knows that. Those first 2 days are when most children are found, either alive and safe or dead and discarded. The statistics are brutal and unforgiving. After 48 hours, the chances of finding a child alive drop dramatically. After a week, they drop to almost nothing. The FBI agents didn't say this to Linda and Tom, but they didn't have to. Everyone in that living room knew what they were racing against. The search continued through the night, flashlights bobbing in the darkness, voices calling out Kevin's name, the sound echoing through the empty streets of Greenfield. The volunteers organized themselves into teams, covering grid patterns, searching every inch of the town and the surrounding countryside. They searched until dawn, and then they kept searching, fueled by coffee and adrenaline and the desperate hope that they might be the one to find him, that they might be the one to bring Kevin Sullivan home. But they found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no body. Kevin had simply vanished, as completely as if he'd never existed at all. The only evidence that something had happened was the spot where the bloodhounds lost his scent, that 30-foot section of asphalt where a child had stopped being a child and become a victim. By the third day, the media presence had grown exponentially. News vans lined the street outside the Sullivan house, satellite dishes pointed at the sky, reporters doing stand-ups with the modest ranch house visible in the background. Linda and Tom gave a press conference, standing on their front lawn with microphones thrust in their faces, cameras recording every tear, every tremor in their voices. Linda held up Kevin's school photo with shaking hands, her voice breaking as she pleaded with whoever had taken her son. "Please," she said, staring directly into the cameras. "Please, if you have Kevin, bring him home. We just want him home. We won't press charges, we won't ask questions, we just want our baby back. Kevin, if you can hear this, Mommy loves you. Daddy loves you. We're looking for you. We're not going to stop looking for you." Tom stood beside her, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He couldn't speak, couldn't form words, could only stand there radiating impotent rage and grief. When a reporter asked him if he had anything to say, he shook his head and walked away, back into the house, slamming the door behind him. The investigation widened. Detectives interviewed every adult who'd been in the neighborhood that morning. They talked to mailmen and delivery drivers and utility workers. They pulled records of registered sex offenders within a 50-mile radius and interviewed each one, checking alibis, looking for any connection to Kevin or the Sullivan family. They searched abandoned buildings and barns and storage units. They dragged the creek and searched the woods with cadaver dogs. They did everything by the book, followed every lead no matter how tenuous, pursued every possibility no matter how unlikely. And they found nothing. Mrs. Henderson remembered seeing Kevin walk by at 10:20. Mrs. Morrison remembered him knocking on her door maybe 5 minutes later. After that, nothing. No one had seen him walking back home. No one had noticed a brown sedan or any other vehicle stopped on that street. No one had heard screams or sounds of struggle. Kevin had walked out of Mrs. Morrison's house and disappeared into thin air in the space of 50 feet. The detective assigned to lead the case, Frank Morrison, had handled missing children cases before, though not many in a town the size of Greenfield. He was methodical and thorough, the kind of cop who didn't cut corners or jump to conclusions. But even he was stumped. There was no evidence because there was nothing to find. Whoever had taken Kevin had been careful, had left no trace, had planned this, or had been incredibly lucky. By the end of the first week, the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit had developed a profile of the likely abductor. Male, probably between 30 and 50 years old, likely someone who lived in or near Greenfield, someone who knew the area and knew Kevin's routine. Possibly someone who'd been watching Kevin for days or weeks, waiting for an opportunity. The profile suggested this wasn't a crime of opportunity but a planned abduction, which meant the abductor was organized, intelligent, and dangerous. The tip line received hundreds of calls. Kevin had been seen in Columbus, in Cleveland, in Kentucky, in Pennsylvania. None of the sightings checked out. People called to report suspicious neighbors, strange cars, men who looked at children too long at the grocery store. Every tip was investigated. Every lead followed to its dead end. The investigation consumed dozens of officers and agents, cost thousands of hours and tens of thousands of dollars, and produced nothing but frustration and heartbreak. As the days turned into weeks, The initial surge of media attention began to fade. Kevin's story was replaced by other stories, other tragedies, other missing children. The news vans packed up and left. The volunteers went back to their regular lives. The search teams were disbanded. The case didn't close. Missing children cases never officially close, but it went cold. The active investigation wound down. The FBI agents returned to their other cases. Detective Morrison kept working it when he could, kept the file on his desk, kept hoping for a break, but there was nowhere left to look. Linda couldn't go back to work. She couldn't function, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. She spent her days sitting in Kevin's room, holding his clothes, staring at his drawings on the wall, waiting for the phone to ring. Every time a car drove down the street, she ran to the window expecting to see Kevin getting out. Every time the phone rang, her heart stopped, hoping it was news, dreading what that news might be. She existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to grieve because he might still be alive, unable to hope because he might already be dead. Tom tried to go back to work, but couldn't concentrate. He'd be on a job site and suddenly find himself staring at nothing, hammer hanging from his hand, completely lost in the horror of not knowing. He started drinking more, started coming home late, started picking fights with Linda over things that didn't matter because the thing that did matter was too big to fight about. Their marriage, already strained by financial stress and the general difficulties of life, began to crack under the weight of their shared grief. They fought about who was to blame. Linda blamed herself for leaving Kevin alone, for going to the grocery store, for not taking him with her. Tom blamed her too, though he tried not to say it, tried to swallow the accusation that rose in his throat every time he looked at her. But she could see it in his eyes, could feel it in the way he pulled away from her touch, in the way he couldn't look at Kevin's photos without his face twisting into something ugly and accusatory. "You left him alone," Tom finally said one night, drunk and raw and broken. "You left him alone, and now he's gone." "You think I don't know that?" Linda screamed back. "You think I don't think about that every second of every day? You think I need you to tell me it's my fault?" They stood in their living room, surrounded by the evidence of their normal life. The couch where they watched television, the coffee table where Kevin had done puzzles, the carpet where he'd played with his toys, and they tore each other apart because they couldn't tear apart the person who'd actually taken their son. They fought until they were both exhausted, until they collapsed into separate chairs and sat in silence. And then Tom got up and left. He didn't come back for 3 days. The community tried to help. The church organized meal trains and prayer vigils. Friends and neighbors stopped by with casseroles and condolences. But after a while, the visits became less frequent. People didn't know what to say, didn't know how to be around grief that had no resolution. They had their own lives, their own children, their own problems. Kevin's disappearance became something that had happened, past tense, something tragic that everyone agreed was terrible, but that ultimately didn't touch their daily existence anymore. Linda and Tom became pariahs in a way, not intentionally, but inevitably. Other parents didn't want to be around them because they represented every parent's worst nightmare. They were a reminder that the world was dangerous, that children could be taken, that nowhere was really safe. At the grocery store, people who used to chat with Linda now avoided eye contact, hurried past with awkward smiles. At the hardware store, Tom's old friends didn't know what to say, so they said nothing, and the silence was worse than anything they could have said. 6 months after Kevin disappeared, the Greenfield Gazette ran a follow-up story. Still missing. The search for Kevin Sullivan continues. It was a well-meaning piece, meant to keep Kevin's case in the public consciousness, but it mostly served to remind everyone that nothing had changed, that Kevin was still gone, that the investigation had stalled. Linda read the article sitting at her kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, and then she carefully cut it out and added it to the scrapbook she'd started, the scrapbook of all the news coverage, all the searches, all the evidence that her son had existed and mattered and was worth looking for. A year passed, then 2 years. Kevin's case file sat in a box in the evidence room at the Greenfield Police Department, one of dozens of unsolved cases, one of hundreds of missing children in Ohio alone, one of thousands across the country. Detective Morrison retired. His replacement inherited the file and did his due diligence, reviewed the evidence, found nothing new to pursue. The case was officially cold, maintained in the database, checked periodically against new information or new evidence from other cases, but essentially dormant. Linda and Tom divorced 3 years after Kevin disappeared. The marriage couldn't survive the strain, couldn't survive the blame and the grief and the absence that filled every room of their house. Linda moved to an apartment in town, couldn't bear to stay in the house where Kevin had lived, where his room still sat exactly as he'd left it the morning he disappeared. Tom sold the house and moved to Columbus, trying to outrun the memories, trying to build a new life where people didn't know him as the father of the missing boy. They stopped talking to each other, stopped being able to be in the same room without the weight of their shared loss crushing them both. Kevin's disappearance had destroyed their marriage, had destroyed their lives, had destroyed any possibility of normalcy or happiness. They became statistics themselves, another family torn apart by tragedy, another cautionary tale about what happens when a child vanishes. But Linda never stopped looking. Even after the police stopped actively investigating, even after the media moved on, even after everyone else forgot, Linda kept Kevin's case alive. She joined support groups for parents of missing children, learned about other cases, learned about the systems and failures that allowed children to disappear. She kept Kevin's photo on flyers posted around town, though they faded and tore and eventually no one noticed them anymore. She called the police department once a month asking if there was any news, knowing there wouldn't be, but needing to ask anyway. On Kevin's birthday, every year, she held a vigil in the town square. The first year, dozens of people came. The second year, maybe 20. By the 5th year, it was just Linda and a handful of diehards from the church, standing in the dark holding candles, singing happy birthday to a boy who would have been 12, 13, 14, who might have been dead for years or might have been alive somewhere with no memory of who he really was. Tom tried to move on. He remarried, had another child, tried to build a new life in Columbus where nobody knew about Kevin, where he could pretend to be just a normal guy with a normal family. But it didn't work. The new marriage was strained from the start, built on the foundation of his unprocessed grief. His new wife didn't understand why he wouldn't talk about his first son, why he flinched when children went missing on the news, why he was so obsessively protective of their daughter that it bordered on paranoia. They fought about it constantly until she finally left too, took their daughter and filed for divorce, and Tom was alone again. Kevin would have been 18 in 1990. Linda marked the day by visiting the Greenfield Police Department, as she did every year on his birthday, asking if there was any news. The officer at the desk knew her by sight now, knew her story, knew what she was going to ask before she asked it. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sullivan. Nothing new. Can I see the file? Can I just look at it again?" The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's. Please, just for a few minutes. I just need to see it." He sighed and went to get Detective Reardon, the current lead on cold cases. Reardon was younger than Morrison had been, less patient, more by the book. He came out to the lobby looking tired and annoyed. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've been through this. There's nothing new in the file. I promise you, if anything comes up, if any new evidence surfaces, you'll be the first person we call. I just want to look at it. I just want to see the photos again, read the statements again. Maybe there's something everyone missed. Maybe. There's nothing there. We've looked. Multiple detectives over multiple years have looked. I understand this is difficult for you, but going through the file over and over isn't going to bring Kevin back." The words hung in the air between them, harsh and true and devastating. Linda's face crumpled. "You've given up on him. All of you. You've decided he's dead, and you've just given up." "We haven't given up," Reardon said, his voice softening slightly. "But we have limited resources, and we have to focus on cases where we have active leads. I'm sorry. I truly am. But there's nothing more we can do right now." Linda walked out of the police station and sat in her car for an hour, crying until she had no tears left, and then she drove home to her empty apartment and looked at the wall covered with photos of Kevin at various ages. 7 years old in his last school photo. Age-progressed images showing what he might look like at 10, at 12, at 15, at 18. She stared at these phantom versions of her son, these computer-generated possibilities, and wondered if she'd recognize him if she passed him on the street. Wondered if he'd recognize her. Wondered if he was even still alive to recognize anyone. The years continued to pass with the relentless cruelty of time that doesn't care about grief. Kevin would have been 21 in 1993, 25 in 1997, 30 in 2002. Linda aged alongside these imaginary milestones, her face growing lined and worn, her hair going gray, her body carrying the physical weight of decades of sorrow. She never remarried, never dated, never even considered it. How could she move on when she didn't know if her son was dead or alive? How could she start a new life when the old one remained unfinished, unresolved, suspended in eternal uncertainty? She kept working at the diner, kept living in her small apartment, kept Kevin's case alive in whatever small way she could. She donated to organizations that searched for missing children, attended conferences about child abduction, learned about new technologies like DNA databases and facial recognition software. She submitted Kevin's dental records and what little DNA evidence they had, a hair from his brush, saliva from an old toothbrush, to every database that would accept them. She did everything she could think of, knowing it probably wouldn't matter, knowing it was probably too late, but unable to stop trying. Tom, meanwhile, spiraled. He moved from Columbus back to southern Ohio, couldn't hold down steady work, drank too much, got into bar fights, spent a night in jail for disorderly conduct. He was angry all the time, angry at the world that had taken his son, angry at the police who'd failed to find him, angry at Linda for leaving Kevin alone that day, angry at himself for not being there, for not protecting his family, for not being the kind of father who could keep his child safe. The anger ate him alive from the inside, corroded everything good that might have remained in his life, left him bitter and alone and broken. He died in 2003, a heart attack at 58 years old, found in his apartment 3 days after it happened because he lived alone and had pushed away everyone who might have checked on him. Linda went to the funeral, stood at the back of the small chapel where a handful of Tom's co-workers and distant relatives had gathered, and she felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, just a vast emptiness. Tom had died years ago, really, the same day Kevin disappeared. This was just his body finally catching up to what had happened to his soul. But while Linda grieved and Tom destroyed himself and the investigation went cold, Kevin Sullivan, or the boy who had been Kevin Sullivan, was living a completely different life, a life that had started the moment that brown sedan drove away from Greenfield that summer morning in 1979. The man who took Kevin was named Richard Howell, though Kevin wouldn't learn that name for many years. Richard was 42 years old in 1979, unmarried, a long-haul truck driver who lived in a small town called Millbrook about 200 miles from Greenfield. He'd been watching Kevin for 3 weeks, driving through Greenfield on his routes, parking on side streets, learning the patterns of the neighborhood, learning Linda's schedule, learning when Kevin was most likely to be alone. It wasn't his first abduction. It wouldn't be his last. But Kevin was special because Kevin was the one who worked, the one who Richard managed to keep. Richard didn't hurt Kevin, not in the way people might assume. He didn't sexually abuse him or physically torture him. His crime was different, more insidious, more psychologically devastating. Richard wanted a son. He'd wanted a child for years, had applied to adopt and been rejected because of his transient lifestyle and his criminal record. Minor offenses, nothing violent, but enough to disqualify him. So he decided to take what the system wouldn't give him. The first few weeks were the hardest. Kevin cried constantly, begged to go home, refused to eat, refused to speak. Richard kept him in a small room in his house, locked in, isolated, with nothing but a mattress and a bucket. He brought Kevin food 3 times a day, spoke to him gently, never raised his voice, never lost his temper. He told Kevin that his parents didn't want him anymore, that they'd sold him, that he belonged to Richard now. He told Kevin that if he tried to run away or tell anyone who he really was, Richard would find him and hurt his mother. "You want your mom to be safe, don't you?" Richard would say, his voice soft and reasonable. "Then you need to be a good boy. You need to do what I say. You need to forget about your old life because that life is over. You're mine now. I'm your father now." Kevin was 7 years old, terrified, traumatized, completely isolated from everything he'd ever known. He had no frame of reference for understanding what was happening to him, no ability to psychologically resist the sustained manipulation and control. Over weeks and then months, his resistance began to crumble. He stopped crying as much. He started eating. He started responding when Richard spoke to him. Not because he accepted what Richard was saying, but because he learned that compliance meant better treatment, meant being let out of the locked room more often, meant having books and toys, meant surviving. Richard was patient. He understood that breaking a child psychologically took time, required consistency, required a delicate balance of control and kindness. He never hit Kevin, never screamed at him, never did anything that would create a clear villain in Kevin's mind. Instead, he created a new reality, one where Richard was the only stable presence, the only source of food and safety and human contact. He created a world where Kevin's memories of his old life began to feel distant and dreamlike, where the trauma of the abduction became something Kevin's mind tried to bury in order to function. After 6 months, Richard started letting Kevin out of the locked room more often. After a year, Kevin had his own bedroom, decorated with posters and toys, almost normal except for the lock on the outside of the door. After 2 years, Richard enrolled Kevin in school, using forged documents that identified him as Kevin Howell, Richard's son, born in 1973 instead of 1972, with a birth certificate Richard had purchased through illegal channels. The school didn't question it. Why would they? Richard seemed like a decent father, a working man doing his best to raise his son alone. Kevin was quiet and withdrawn, but plenty of kids were quiet and withdrawn. His school records showed he'd been homeschooled previously, which explained any gaps in his education. There were no red flags, no obvious signs that anything was wrong, because Richard had been careful. He'd moved to a different town, established a new identity for Kevin, created a paper trail that would satisfy casual scrutiny. And Kevin, at 9 years old, with 2 years of sustained psychological manipulation and control behind him, didn't tell anyone who he really was. Partly because he believed Richard's threats about hurting his mother, partly because he'd learned that resistance only made things worse, and partly because his memories of his old life had become so fragmented and confused that he wasn't entirely sure anymore what was real and what was a dream. He remembered a woman with blonde hair who might have been his mother. He remembered a house with white siding and a yard where he played with toy cars. But these memories felt far away, felt like they belonged to someone else, felt increasingly unreal compared to the life he was living now. Richard reinforced this constantly. "You were always Kevin Howell," he'd say. "Those other memories are just dreams. Your mother died when you were little. I'm your father. I've always been your father." And Kevin, desperate for stability, desperate for some kind of normal life, desperate to make the cognitive dissonance stop, began to believe it. Or at least, he stopped fighting it. He went to school as Kevin Howell. He made friends, though he was never close to anyone, always maintaining a distance, always holding something back. He did his homework, got decent grades, played sports occasionally, lived what appeared to be a relatively normal childhood. Teachers who met Richard thought he was a bit odd, a bit isolated, but lots of single fathers were odd and isolated. Kevin seemed well-fed, well-clothed, not obviously abused. There was nothing that triggered mandatory reporting, nothing that made anyone look twice. And so Kevin Sullivan disappeared completely, replaced by Kevin Howell, a quiet boy with a truck driver father, a boy who moved frequently because of his father's work, a boy who had no extended family and no roots anywhere. They moved every few years, from Millbrook to Ashland, from Ashland to Marion, from Marion to Mansfield. Always small towns in Ohio, always places where people minded their own business, where a man and his son could live quietly without attracting much attention. Richard was careful never to let Kevin have too much freedom. He monitored who Kevin spent time with, discouraged close friendships, never let Kevin go to other kids' houses unsupervised. He framed it as protection, as caring, as a father who'd already lost one wife and wasn't going to risk losing his son too. And Kevin, who had no basis for comparison, who'd been isolated for so long, accepted these restrictions as normal. As Kevin grew older, the psychological control became more sophisticated. Richard didn't need to lock doors anymore. He'd built the prison inside Kevin's mind. Kevin's identity as Kevin Sullivan had been buried so deep, overlaid with so many years of being Kevin Howell, that it wasn't a conscious presence anymore. It was something that occasionally surfaced in dreams, in fleeting moments of déjà vu, in unexplained feelings of wrongness that Kevin couldn't articulate. But it wasn't real to him. It was background noise, easily dismissed, easily ignored. Kevin talked for 3 hours straight, his voice hoarse and shaking, telling them everything he could remember. He told them about the fragmentary memories of his childhood before Richard, the dreams that had haunted him for years, the wrongness he'd always felt about his own identity. He told them about finding the newspaper clippings, about the other missing children Richard might have taken, about the 17 years he'd lived as someone else. He spread the evidence across the table, the clippings, the photos, the documents, and watched as the detectives examined each piece with growing intensity. "This is going to take time to verify," one detective said finally. "We'll need to contact the Greenfield Police Department, pull the original case file, compare what you're telling us with the evidence from 1979. We'll need DNA, fingerprints if they exist from the original investigation, dental records." "I understand," Kevin said. I need to know for sure. I need to know if I'm really him. If what you're telling us is true," the other detective said carefully, "then you're a victim. You understand that, right? You were a child. What happened to you wasn't your fault." Kevin nodded, but he didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. 17 years of living a lie, of not knowing, of being complicit in his own disappearance. It felt like fault, even if logically he knew better. They kept him at the station, not under arrest, but not free to leave either, while they made calls and pulled records. The Greenfield Police Department was contacted. Detective Reardon, still working cold cases after all these years, got the call in the middle of the night and thought at first it was a prank. Kevin Sullivan had been missing for 19 years. Hundreds of tips had come in over the years, all of them false. This would be false too. But he pulled the file anyway, drove to Columbus in the middle of the night, walked into the interview room, where Kevin sat hunched over a cup of cold coffee, looking exhausted and terrified. Reardon stared at him for a long moment, trying to see the 7-year-old boy from the photos in this 26-year-old man's face. It was impossible. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. "Tell me something only Kevin Sullivan would know," Reardon said, sitting down across from him. Kevin closed his eyes, tried to reach back through the fog of 17 years, through the suppressed memories and the psychological manipulation. "I had toy cars," he said finally. "I was playing with them in the dirt by the driveway. There was a red one, a Corvette maybe, and a blue truck. I was making roads for them." Reardon felt something cold slide down his spine. That detail had never been released to the media. Linda Sullivan had mentioned it in her initial statement, had said Kevin's toys were still in the yard when she got home, but it hadn't made it into any news reports. "What else?" "My mom worked at a diner. The copper something. Copper kettle. She smelled like coffee and bacon when she came home from her shifts." Kevin's voice cracked. "My dad taught me to fish. We went to a creek, I don't remember where, but I remember he was patient with me even though I was bad at it. I remember he showed me how to bait the hook, and I was scared of the worms." These weren't details that could be researched, weren't things that appeared in news reports or public records. These were memories, real and specific and impossible to fake. Reardon felt his skepticism beginning to crumble. "We're going to need DNA," he said. "Your mother, Linda Sullivan. We'll need to contact her, get a sample for comparison." Kevin flinched at the mention of his mother, at the name that felt simultaneously foreign and deeply familiar. Is she still alive?" "Yes. She still lives in Greenfield. She never stopped looking for you." The words hit Kevin like a physical blow. Never stopped looking. 19 years of searching, of hoping, of not knowing. Because of him. Because he'd gotten into that car. Because he'd let Richard break him. Because he'd lived as Kevin Howell for so long that Kevin Sullivan had ceased to exist. "I don't know what to say to her," he whispered. "I don't even remember what she looks like." "Let's take this one step at a time," Reardon said, though his mind was already racing ahead, already thinking about the logistics of this, the verification process, the media circus that would ensue if this turned out to be real. "First, we confirm your identity. Then we figure out the rest." The DNA testing took 3 weeks. Kevin stayed in Columbus, renting a cheap motel room, not working, barely functioning, waiting for confirmation of who he was. The detectives kept in touch, told him the process was moving as quickly as possible, but 3 weeks felt like an eternity. He called the motel room home, but it wasn't home. Richard's house wasn't home. He had no home, had no identity, was suspended between 2 versions of himself, unable to fully be either one. Linda Sullivan was contacted by Detective Reardon personally. He drove to her apartment, knocked on her door late on a Wednesday evening, and when she answered, he saw immediately that the years had not been kind to her. She was 51 years old, but looked 65, her face lined with grief, her body thin and frail, her eyes haunted. She looked at the detective, and her face went white. "Did you find him? Did you find Kevin?" "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to sit down." There's been a development in Kevin's case. She let him in, sat on her worn couch, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Reardon explained as gently as he could that a man had come forward claiming to be Kevin, that he had evidence, that they needed DNA for comparison, that nothing was confirmed yet, but they had reason to believe this might be real. Linda didn't speak for a full minute. She just stared at Reardon, tears streaming down her face, her mouth working silently. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. He's alive? Kevin is alive. We don't know yet for certain, but there's a strong possibility. Where is he? Where has he been? Why didn't he come home? That's complicated. If this is Kevin, he was abducted and raised by his abductor. He didn't know who he really was until recently. He didn't know you were looking for him. Linda made a sound that was part sob, part scream, a noise of pure anguish. 19 years. 19 years of believing her son was probably dead, of living with the guilt of having left him alone that morning, of searching and hoping and grieving. And he'd been alive the whole time, living 200 miles away, raised by the man who'd taken him. I want to see him, she said. When can I see him? Let's wait for the DNA results first. I know it's hard, but we need to be certain. I don't need DNA. I'll know my son when I see him. But she agreed to wait, agreed to provide a DNA sample, agreed to let the process unfold. What choice did she have? She'd waited 19 years. She could wait 3 more weeks. The DNA results came back on a Friday afternoon in December 1998. Detective Reardon got the call from the lab, heard the confirmation he'd been simultaneously hoping for and dreading, and sat at his desk for a long moment before picking up the phone to make the necessary calls. The man calling himself Kevin Howell was Kevin Sullivan. The match was definitive, undeniable, 99.9% certainty. The boy who'd been missing for 19 years had been found. Reardon called Kevin first, reached him at the motel. It's a match, Reardon said simply. You're Kevin Sullivan. Kevin felt the world tilt beneath him. He'd known, logically, that this would be the result, but hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting it. This was real now. Undeniable. He was Kevin Sullivan, had always been Kevin Sullivan, and everything he believed about himself for the past 19 years was a constructed fiction. What happens now? Kevin asked, his voice hollow. Now we notify your mother. And then, if you're ready, we arrange for you to meet her. I don't know if I'm ready. I don't think anyone could be ready for this. But she's waited 19 years, Kevin. She deserves to see you. Kevin agreed, because what else could he do? He couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep living in this limbo between identities. The truth was out now, had been verified by science, was undeniable and irreversible. He was Kevin Sullivan, and Kevin Sullivan had a mother who'd never stopped looking for him. Linda got the call an hour later. She was at work, waiting tables at the Copper Kettle where she'd worked for 30 years, when her cell phone rang. She saw Reardon's name on the caller ID and her hand started shaking so badly, she almost dropped the phone. It's him, Reardon said without preamble. The DNA confirms it. Kevin is alive. Linda's knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor of the diner, the phone still pressed to her ear, sobs racking her entire body. Her co-workers rushed over, alarmed, and she managed to choke out the words between sobs. They found him. They found Kevin. He's alive. My baby is alive. The entire diner erupted in noise, crying, exclamations of disbelief, people rushing to call neighbors and friends. The news spread through Greenfield like wildfire. Kevin Sullivan, missing for 19 years, presumed dead by almost everyone, had been found alive. It was a miracle, people said. It was impossible. It was the best news the town had heard in decades. But for Kevin and Linda, the reality was far more complicated than a simple happy ending. They were strangers now, separated by 19 years of time and trauma, connected only by biology and fragmented memories. The boy Linda had lost at 7 no longer existed. The woman Kevin couldn't quite remember was about to re-enter his life. Neither of them knew how to navigate this impossible situation. The meeting was arranged for the following Monday at the Columbus Police Station, neutral territory, with counselors and detectives present. Kevin barely slept the night before, his mind racing with anxiety and dread and a strange, complicated hope he didn't know what to do with. He tried to prepare something to say, tried to figure out how to explain 19 years of absence to a woman he couldn't remember, but every word felt inadequate. Linda drove to Columbus with her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, her mind a chaos of emotions. Joy that Kevin was alive. Rage at Richard Howell for stealing her son. Grief for the 19 years they'd lost. Fear that Kevin wouldn't recognize her, wouldn't remember her, wouldn't want anything to do with her. Hope that somehow, impossibly, they could find their way back to each other. She arrived at the police station at exactly 2 p.m., as scheduled. She was led to a conference room where Kevin was already waiting, standing by the window, his back to the door. He turned when she entered, and they stared at each other across the space of the room. Across the space of 19 years, two people who were supposed to be mother and son, but who had no shared experiences, no shared memories of the past 2 decades. Linda saw a tall, thin man with brown hair and haunted eyes, and she searched desperately for traces of the 7-year-old boy she'd lost. The shape of his face maybe. The way he stood. Something in his expression that reminded her of Tom. But he was a stranger. Her son, but a stranger. Kevin saw a woman who looked older than her years, worn down by grief and time, and he tried to match her face to the fragmented memories in his head. Blonde hair, though graying now. Blue eyes. Something familiar in her posture, in the way she looked at him with such desperate hope. Kevin, Linda whispered, and then she was moving, crossing the room, reaching for him with shaking hands. Kevin stood frozen as she approached, unsure whether to step back or step forward, his entire body tense with conflicting impulses. When Linda's hands touched his face, gentle and hesitant, something inside him fractured. This woman was his mother. This stranger was his mother. She had carried him, given birth to him, raised him for 7 years, and then lost him through no fault of his own or hers. The injustice of it was overwhelming. "I'm sorry," Kevin said, the words tumbling out. "I'm so sorry. I should have remembered. I should have known. I should have come home." "No," Linda said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "No, baby, this wasn't your fault. None of this was your fault. You were a child. You were taken from me. You have nothing to apologize for." But Kevin was crying now too, 19 years of suppressed grief pouring out of him. "I forgot you. I forgot everything. I lived as his son. I called him Dad. I didn't even know who I was. He did that to you. He broke you and remade you, and that was his crime, not yours. You survived, Kevin. That's what matters. You survived, and you found your way back to me." They held each other, this mother and son who were strangers, and they cried together while the detectives and counselors present gave them what privacy they could. It wasn't a happy reunion, not really. It was too complicated for happiness, too laden with grief and loss and the weight of 19 stolen years. But it was a beginning. It was the first tentative step toward healing something that had been broken so profoundly that neither of them knew if it could ever be truly repaired. They talked for hours that afternoon, trying to bridge the impossible gap between them. Linda told Kevin about the search, about the investigation, about the years of waiting and hoping. She told him about Tom, about how the loss had destroyed their marriage, about how Tom had died 5 years ago never knowing that Kevin was alive. That news hit Kevin particularly hard. His father, his real father, had died believing Kevin was gone, had destroyed himself with grief and guilt, had never gotten closure or peace. The waste of it was staggering. Kevin told Linda, haltingly, about his years as Kevin Howell, about Richard, about the manipulation and control, about the slow erasure of his original identity, about the dreams that had haunted him, the sense of wrongness, the fragmented memories that he'd dismissed as imagination, about finding the newspaper clippings and the devastating realization of what had been done to him, about the other children Richard might have taken, the evidence Kevin had found that suggested he wasn't the only victim. There were others? Linda asked, her face going pale. "I think so. I found photos, news clippings about other missing children. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they escaped or if they didn't survive. But I wasn't the only one." The implications were horrifying. Richard Howell had been a serial child abductor, operating for decades, and Kevin was just the one case that had finally come to light. How many other families were still searching? How many other children had disappeared into Richard's care and never been found? The investigation expanded immediately. Detectives went through Richard's house with forensic teams, cataloged every piece of evidence Kevin had found, and searched for more. They found photos of at least 6 other boys spanning 3 decades, found newspaper clippings about missing children from Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. They found graves in the woods behind Richard's house, small graves that yielded the remains of 3 children who'd been missing since the 1970s and 80s. The revelation made national news. Richard Howell became the center of one of the most extensive child abduction investigations in Ohio history, even though he was dead and beyond prosecution. For Kevin, this discovery compounded his trauma. He'd lived with a serial killer, had been raised by a monster, had been one of the lucky ones simply because he'd survived. The guilt was crushing. While he'd been going to school and working and living a relatively normal life, other children had been suffering and dying. He'd been in Richard's house while those graves were being dug. He'd sat at dinner with a man who'd murdered children. The psychological weight was unbearable. He moved back to Greenfield, moved in with Linda because he had nowhere else to go, and because they both needed to try to rebuild some kind of relationship. It was awkward and painful and nothing like a normal mother-son dynamic. They were strangers learning to live together, navigating complicated emotions and trauma, trying to create connection where there was only absence and loss. Linda showed Kevin the house where they'd lived, the small ranch on Maple Street that had been sold years ago. They stood outside looking at it, and Kevin tried desperately to remember, to feel some recognition, some sense of home. But there was nothing. Just a house like any other house, meaningless and foreign. They visited Tom's grave, Linda kneeling in the grass and telling her ex-husband that Kevin had been found, that their son was alive, that he could rest now. Kevin stood behind her, staring at the headstone. Thomas Sullivan, 1945 to 2003, beloved father, and felt a grief so profound it threatened to pull him under. He had no memories of this man beyond fragments and dreams. He would never get to know him, never get to say he was sorry, never get to build an adult relationship with his father. Richard Howell had stolen that possibility along with everything else. The media attention was intense and invasive. Kevin's story made headlines nationally. Missing boy found after 19 years, raised by his abductor. The house was surrounded by news vans. Reporters shouted questions whenever Kevin or Linda left. The phone rang constantly with interview requests. Kevin hated it, hated the exposure, hated having his trauma turned into entertainment for strangers. But he agreed to do one interview, one press conference, because Detective Reardon convinced him it might help other families with missing children, might generate tips about the other boys in Richard's photos. He sat beside Linda at a folding table in the Greenfield police station, cameras pointed at them, reporters crowding the room, and he told his story. He spoke about the abduction, about living as Kevin Howell, about the psychological control and manipulation. He spoke about finding the truth and the devastating realization of what had been stolen from him. He spoke about the other victims, showed the photos of the unidentified boys, asked anyone who might recognize them to come forward. I was lucky, Kevin said, his voice flat and affectless. I survived, but other children didn't. Other families are still searching for their sons, still waiting for answers. If you recognize any of these boys, if you have any information about Richard Howell or his activities, please contact the police. Please help bring closure to these families the way I've been able to have closure, such as it is. The press conference generated hundreds of tips. 3 of the boys in the photos were identified: Daniel Murphy, missing since 1976, Christopher Wade, missing since 1981, Marcus Chun, missing since 1987. Their families were contacted, given the news that their sons had died, shown where they were buried. It was the worst kind of closure, but it was closure. The other 3 boys remained unidentified. Their photos circulated nationally. Their case is still open. Kevin cooperated fully with the investigation into Richard Howell's crimes. He gave statements, underwent hours of interviews, allowed psychologists to document his case for future research into long-term child abduction. He became, in a sense, a spokesperson for victims of parental abduction and child exploitation, though he hated the role and the attention it brought. His relationship with Linda slowly, painfully, began to develop into something resembling a mother-son bond. It would never be normal, could never be what it should have been, but they learned to care for each other in their own complicated way. Linda learned about the man Kevin had become: quiet, damaged, intensely private, struggling with PTSD and depression and survivor's guilt. Kevin learned about the woman Linda had been before he was taken and the woman she'd become after, stronger than she looked, relentlessly determined, still carrying hope even after 19 years of reasons not to. They went to therapy together, individual and joint sessions, working through the trauma and loss, trying to build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. It was slow, frustrating work. There were setbacks and breakdowns, days when Kevin couldn't get out of bed and days when Linda couldn't stop crying. But they kept trying, kept showing up, kept choosing each other despite how hard it was. Kevin struggled to find his place in the world. He legally changed his name back to Kevin Sullivan, went through the bureaucratic nightmare of establishing his real identity, correcting records, reclaiming his life. He tried to work, but found it difficult to hold down jobs, his PTSD making it hard to function in normal environments. He tried to make friends, but found it impossible to connect with people, to explain his past, to be vulnerable. He was 26 years old, but in many ways he was still 7, still that frightened child who'd gotten into a stranger's car. The legal aftermath was complicated. Richard Howell was dead, beyond prosecution, but there were questions about whether anyone else had been complicit in his crimes. The investigation looked into whether teachers or neighbors or social workers had missed signs, whether systems had failed, whether Kevin's abduction could have been prevented or his rescue achieved sooner. No one was criminally charged, but the case revealed numerous failures in how missing children cases were handled, in how schools verified identities, in how abductors could hide in plain sight for decades. Kevin filed a civil suit against Richard Howell's estate, seeking damages for the 19 years stolen from him. The case was settled out of court. Richard had little money, but there was a small life insurance policy and the sale of his house. Kevin donated most of the settlement to organizations that searched for missing children, keeping only enough to pay for his ongoing therapy. Years passed. Kevin turned 30, then 35, slowly building a life that felt more stable, if never quite normal. He worked part-time, enough to support himself, but not so much that it overwhelmed him. He volunteered with missing children organizations, speaking to families, offering hope and perspective from someone who'd been through it. He maintained his relationship with Linda, Sunday dinners, and weekly phone calls, a connection that was genuine even if it could never fully compensate for what they'd lost. He never married, never had children of his own. The thought of being a father terrified him, brought up too many associations with Richard, too much fear that he might somehow perpetuate the damage that had been done to him. He had relationships, but they never lasted. His partners eventually frustrated by his inability to fully open up, by the walls he'd built to protect himself, by the ways trauma had shaped him into someone who couldn't fully trust or connect. But he survived. That was the bottom line. The thing Linda reminded him of whenever the depression got bad, whenever he questioned whether life was worth living. He survived when other children hadn't. He found his way back when the odds were impossibly against it. He reclaimed his identity and his truth and built a life that, while damaged and difficult, was his own. Linda passed away in 2015, 68 years old, cancer that spread too fast to treat. Kevin was with her at the end, holding her hand, and her last words to him were, "I never stopped loving you." Not for a single day. He carried those words with him, a small comfort against the ocean of loss. After Linda died, Kevin moved away from Greenfield. The town held too many ghosts, too many memories both real and constructed. He settled in Oregon, as far from Ohio as he could get while staying in the continental United States, and there he found something approaching peace. He worked in a bookstore, lived in a small apartment, kept to himself mostly, but had a few casual friendships, people who knew his story but didn't define him by it. Now, if you've made it this far in Kevin's story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below telling us what struck you most about this case. And if you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We cover cases like this, stories that need to be told, truths that need to be remembered. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Kevin's case changed things in small but meaningful ways. It led to improvements in how missing children cases were handled, how identities were verified, how schools and social services checked backgrounds. It inspired new legislation about child abduction, about the rights of victims, about how long-term psychological manipulation should be understood and addressed. His story became a case study in psychology programs, a cautionary tale in law enforcement training, a reminder that children could disappear not just into death, but into new identities, hidden in plain sight for decades. The question that haunted the beginning of this story, how does a child vanish for 25 years without anyone knowing the truth, has an answer now, though it's not a comforting one. Children vanish because predators are patient and careful. They vanish because systems fail and people miss signs. They vanish because a 7-year-old child can be psychologically broken and remade, their original identity buried so deep they forget who they were. They vanish because the world is bigger and more dangerous than we want to believe, and because evil doesn't always look like we expect it to look. But Kevin's story also reminds us that the disappeared can be found, that DNA and persistence and sheer luck can sometimes bring the impossible full circle, that a mother's love doesn't fade even after 19 years of silence. That truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually surfaces. That survival, even damaged survival, is worth fighting for. Kevin Sullivan is 53 years old now, living a quiet life, still doing the work of healing from trauma that can never fully heal. He's not the boy who disappeared in 1979, and he's not quite the man who discovered his true identity in 1998. He's something else, something new, forged from both identities and neither, a survivor who carries his scars but isn't defined by them. He was missing for 25 years, not because no one cared, not because the search wasn't thorough enough, not because his mother gave up hope, but because the truth hid in plain sight, buried under a false identity and years of psychological control. His story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the possibility of recovery even from the most devastating losses, and to the fact that some questions, no matter how long they take to answer, deserve to be pursued until the truth finally emerges. And in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not the abduction or the investigation or even the reunion, but the simple, profound truth that identity matters, that knowing who you are and where you come from matters, that the connections we make in childhood shape us in ways we can't escape, no matter how much time passes or how thoroughly someone tries to erase them. Kevin Sullivan got his name back, got his truth back, got his mother back, even if he could never get back the 19 years that were stolen. And that, in a world where so many missing children are never found, where so many families never get answers, is something worth acknowledging. The story ends here, but the impact continues. Every time a missing child is found, Kevin's case is remembered. Every time a family refuses to give up hope, Linda's determination is honored. Every time the systems designed to protect children are improved, Richard Howell's crimes serve as a reminder of why that work matters. This is the legacy of Kevin Sullivan's disappearance and return, not a happy ending, because there can't be happy endings when so much has been lost, but a meaningful one. A reminder that truth matters, that justice matters, that every missing child deserves to be searched for, remembered, and if possible, brought home. Thank you for watching this investigation into one of the most complex missing person cases in recent history. If this story moved you, please share it with others who care about these issues. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into cases that matter. Until next time, remember, the disappeared deserve to be remembered, and the truth, no matter how long it takes, deserves to be told.